Good morning and welcome to the second in the two-part series, or the three-part series, from grief to taking action for prevention, bridging the gap. Thank you for joining this second of the webinars. I'm Derek Longmire, and I'm the program manager here at Drug Free Action Alliance, and will be assisting Allison Scherer, who is today's presenter. While a number of our programs are known nationally, Drug Free Action Alliance is a statewide private nonprofit agency founded in 1987. Drug Free Action Alliance mission is to provide leadership and foster networks to promote safe and drug-free communities throughout Ohio, and it is accomplished through providing statewide and community environmental changes to reduce substance abuse, increasing public awareness of substance abuse and its harmful effects, and helping to develop the statewide prevention infrastructure. As a quick reminder, there are 3 parts in this webinar series. Part 1 was held on January 29th. However, you do not need to have participated in the past webinar to participate in today's. For those of you who were unable to join the webinar or who experienced audio difficulties during last session, a recorded version is available and was sent to you with your confirmation email in the link. It is also available on the Member Center of the Drug Free Action Alliance website. For each webinar, we'll provide those that are in Ohio with an RCH certificate. For those of you who are outside of Ohio, you will receive a certificate of completion. In order for you to receive a certificate of attendance, you must attend the full webinar, plus complete the brief evaluation. You will receive a link to the evaluation in an email following today's session. If you are a group of people who are attending the webinar from one computer, please have each participant complete an evaluation. And for group viewing, if you do not already complete a group sign-in sheet, we can send one to you immediately following the call. A group sign-in sheet is necessary for each person to get credit for attendance, so even if you're sharing one computer, each person needs to be accounted in the group sign-in sheet. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's event. There are two ways you can hear the webinar today. One is through the speakers on your computer. The other is by using the phone. For those of you who are listening through your computer speakers, if you experience problems, you might want to consider dialing in through your phone. However, while there is no charge to listen through your computer speakers, there may be a long distance charge for you through your regular telephone service provider. If you need technical assistance during the webinar for audiovisual or other problems, please write down this number. The technical assistance number is 1-800-263-6317. And for a few webinar tips. You will be muted throughout the entire 1-hour session today. If you want to ask a question or communicate with us, you can do so by typing a comment or question in the question area on your control panel. Your control panel is located down the right-hand side of your screen. You can open or collapse the control panel by hitting the red arrow. If you can't see your control panel, then click the red arrow to open. And please note that we will not be using the chat box in today's session, but we will be using the question section at the bottom of your panel. Simply type your question, click send, and your question will be submitted to us. Other participants on today's webinar will not be able to see your questions, only the organizer of today's session. You may ask your question at any time throughout the session. However, questions specific to content will only be answered during 2 stopping times throughout today's webinar. The first will be at a midway point, and the second will be at the end of today's call. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted in the Member Center of the Drug Free Action Alliance website, as well as links to other helpful resources. During the presentation, there will be opportunities beyond asking questions for your involvement in today's webinar through the use of polls. Poll questions will be launched at various points of the webinar, and you will be asked to participate by answering the poll questions provided to you in real time. This will keep you engaged in the webinar. Also, you will interact with other webinar participants, and this also serves as a participation verification. Just a tip before we move along is to please close all other computer programs. This will help prevent screen lag time, and if you're listening through your speakers, it will also help that as well. Handouts were sent to you. You should have received the handouts for this presentation via link that was emailed to you last week. These handouts are a guide to the topics that we'll cover today and can be helpful for taking notes. The handouts will remain available through the provided link and will also be in the Drug Free Action Alliance Member Center where this presentation is posted online. And certificates will be sent to you in 30 days. At this point, I believe that all of the housekeeping duties have been taken care of, and we're ready to get started. Today's speaker is Allison Scherer. Allison is an Ohio Certified Prevention Specialist 2 and has worked in the prevention field since 1983. She serves as the Director of Prevention Programs and Services at Drug Free Action Alliance here in Columbus, Ohio. And her experience includes working with youth-led prevention, community-based prevention, environmental prevention, and drug-free workplace. She has developed and presented workshops, trainings, and other educational opportunities for a wide variety of audiences. Allison is the past president of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention Association of Ohio, also known as ADAPO, and also serves on the former Ohio Credentialing Board as chair of the Prevention Committee. Allison, over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. This is Allison Scherer with Drug Free Action Alliance, and I'm happy to be here presenting Part 2, and I'll be presenting Part 3 of our Bridging the Gap webinar series. Today, as Derek said, the focus is what works in prevention, the lessons learned from our past, and wanted to first start by saying that I'm hoping everybody did go online and through that webinar link get our handouts. Those 3 handouts are meant to serve as a note-taking guide today. Learning theory tells us that PowerPoint is actually not our friend, and that when folks get so invested in having that PowerPoint handout, they tend to, particularly in a webinar setting, disengage more often, counting on the fact that they have the handout if they ever needed to refer to it, and then you never refer to it ever again. It's in a file somewhere in your desk. So based on good learning theory and wanting to engage you more, thought it might be better if we had the key content points in handouts for you, and then you could take notes with those. That's everything learning theory tells us to do. So I want you to think of those more as a note-taking guide. I'm hoping everybody did go to the link that was sent to you in your email, and you were able to access our 3 handouts that we'll be using today. Now, while I know some of you are possibly scrambling to go find your handouts, I still would like to go ahead and have us do a poll. And it's our first opportunity to interact with each other today, and it'll be helpful to me to get a better sense of the level of experience with prevention we have here on the webinar today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. You'll see a question come up on your screen, and if you could just answer that, we will post the results. Still have a few people needing to answer the poll. All right, let's take a look at these results. It looks like that we have almost even Stevens here. About 38% of folks on the line have worked in the prevention or in a related field, but prevention is new to them. And about a third of us have worked in the field for at least 2 years. We do have a couple that are certified prevention specialists, and a small handful of folks who are pretty new, coming to us as a concerned community member who is new to prevention or has had some level of training in prevention, but is overall still fairly new. So that's very helpful to know where we are with everyone on the call. And that's helpful as I proceed, so thank you for taking the time to do that. As we get started, I heard somebody once say this quote that I want to break down for you, that when we're talking about change in our community, there's a lot of different things that are going on in our society today, and alcohol and drug abuse is but one. But whatever the issue is, we tend to have a group of people who are awake to it and are saying, look, we need change. And some of you may have been more recently come awake to this issue because of a personal connection to it through a family member or a friend's use or a loss of a family member or friend. Or maybe that's what got you involved in a coalition or working in this field. And so you're awake to it, and we're clamoring for change, and we know change is needed. The problem is as we're all trying to get this movement going to get more people to understand that we do need change and we need everyone to be involved, we also need to know how to make that change happen, how to set a course, a direction for making that change meaningful and effective and lasting in our communities. And so then we get this quote that a friend of mine said over 20 years ago in prevention that still sticks with me today. We need this movement piece of prevention. We need folks banging the drum and shining a spotlight on the issue and saying that we need change. But we also need to be very grounded in the discipline of prevention. This is a public health issue. There's a great deal of public health science in general as well as specific to alcohol, tobacco, and other drug abuse prevention. And there's a lot of folks as concerned community members who are getting more and more involved in coalitions and family engagement advocacy groups and task forces trying to deal with the issue, particularly with our opiate crisis today. And we know that that energy and that want for change is crucial. But unfortunately, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what works and what doesn't work. And some things in prevention that don't work are counterintuitive. Things that we would think work, that our human gut instinct tells us would be the way to go, science has actually found can even backfire on us and help contribute to further problems in the community. So that's what today's workshop or webinar is really all about, is looking at how we can be more grounded in the discipline of prevention, because as we begin our work or ground our work in research-supported prevention strategies, I know if you've heard this quote before, that it's really kind of like, you know, the difference between taking the stairs, which is a lot of effort, and we may still eventually get where we want to go, versus taking the escalator, where we can get where we want to go a whole lot faster, and maybe without some side trips, especially if, I don't know, you're in the Harry Potter movie and the stairs keep changing. I don't know. Maybe that's the graphic I needed, you know, because sometimes we think we're on the right path and we're doing a lot of work, and then it still doesn't get us where we needed to go when we're not grounded in the science. So to start this piece on science-based prevention and this overview today, I thought it would be best for us to just define prevention. And a lot of folks, when they first hear prevention, they really think about prevention as you know, classroom-based education with kids in schools and doing education in whatever form or format, and it's like facts, and if you just knew what this stuff did, people would never put it in their body. And I think we all know that prevention's so much more than that. If you just look at cigarette smoking, how many people have all crossed all age spans know that cigarettes aren't healthy, know about tar, know about cancer risk and emphysema, but knowledge itself by itself doesn't create the behaviors that we want. So prevention, of course, is more than just education. So let's define it as a broader scope that it is. And this is where I'd really like to refer you to your handout that was called the Prevention Taxonomy. And that's a document that was recently published and distributed by the Ohio Department of Alcohol and Drug Addiction Services with our new, as of 2013 now, definition for prevention here in Ohio. Some of you in other states, you may have your own state, you know, stamp of approval definition. This is how Ohio is approaching prevention currently. And that is defining it as promoting the health and safety of individuals, but as well communities, that there's a community health issue here, and we have to look at this as a systems and community issue, not just an individual attitude, belief, or behavior issue, which means we have to address community norms. We have to address access and availability. We have to address media messaging and policy and enforcement of those policies, whether that's a law or whether that's the athletic team policy or a family policy, sports team policy. All kinds of things can come in when we think of this, not just as individuals, but also communities. Also, the other piece of this definition that's very important is that prevention focuses on preventing or delaying the onset of behavioral health problems. So when we really look at the definition, it's that delaying the onset of problems, such as substance abuse, addiction, problem gambling, other related problems. So delaying the onset is the real key words there. we're sure whether we were successful. How do you measure what didn't happen? You know, that's a real tough one for our field. As we do the work of a planned sequence of call strategies are intended to facilitate attitude as well as behavior change, again, at both the individual and the community level. So the key words there to me is a planned sequence. You may want to circle that in your definition on your handout. That planned sequence is so important. It's not a one-shot deal. That it's not just a single presentation. So, for example, even 10, 15 years ago, Safe and Drug-Free Schools money, I knew a school that blew all, like 1,000, maybe 1,500, and they blew it all on one big keynote speaker that they brought in once a year, piled everybody into the gym for a big presentation, and thought that was going to inoculate all the kids of their school and therefore community, and that was it. That was all they were going to do for prevention, and that would work. That's not a planned sequence of strategies that is age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, surrounds them. Choices aren't made in a vacuum. They're not made in that one day. They need to be reinforced. People need to internalize why to say. So it's a one-shot deal. Another way to really look at prevention that's important is the continuum of care. Prevention services do not include clinical assessment, treatment, or recovery support services. Folks that are at that point with use, abuse, and then those folks are further down the continuum of care than where we are with notes on our hand here in just a minute during the next poll to see if we can solve that problem. So the problem is that next poll is a little ways away. So if you're still having that problem, or if I sound choppy to other people, I sound fine. If I sound choppy to you, would you let us know through the question box so we can kind of take a straw poll whether that problem is on your end or our end? That would be helpful. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and take a look at this continuum of care a little bit more to clarify this. Prevention, and then how those services change more to intervention as use progresses. Task force or some kind of community group for community change, and that can include family engagement advocacy groups for family groups that are getting support from each other after a loss due to this issue from a family member or close friend. And they're wanting to also work together to advocate for change so it doesn't happen to anyone else. That's what we call a family engagement advocacy group. So if your community action group...
Go to webinar, web events made easy.
One of the best things as we're looking at what works prevention is to first, follow that old adage. How do we know where we're going if we don't know where we've been? So if we're looking at our own history, we have learned a great deal in the 200-plus years just in this country of our approach and efforts in dealing with, from alcohol to all kinds of other substances over the years. And we've got a great deal of School of Hard Knocks to lean into, as well as research-based science of what we know doesn't work. So I want to start there with the lessons learned. And our first lesson learned, by the way, you have a handout that enumerates 10 lessons learned, is that we're walking in the shoes of everybody who came before us trying to prevent this stuff, and therefore what we do today will also outlive us, and there will be people in the future walking in our shoes, and they may or may not be grateful for it, depending on what we're doing. So for example, some of you may know, as we live in the shadow of the past, of Reefer Madness, for example, was an approach by the government to put out some films that a lot of people would call propaganda films about marijuana, even listed it as a narcotic drug within that film, really showed extreme consequences of use that were not even accurate to what marijuana does. And it was all to scare people away. And because of things like that, we now have to constantly face within the population, there's just this feeling that anything you say negative against marijuana is being trumped up, and that the government somehow has an interest in keeping us all not from using weed. And we face that, especially right now in our current culture today. We're still walking in the shoes of that past. We're even walking in the shoes from clear back in the founding of our country, and early the birth of the Temperance movement, which later, 100-plus years later, led to Prohibition. But early in Temperance, before they wanted to prohibit all alcohol, beer, wine, and ale were still seen as okay. It was hard liquor that was seen as the problem, because we couldn't necessarily trust the water source, and beer, wine, and ale were very much a part of daily living. But as soon as that hard liquor came on the scene and there was more distilling happening, When my folks came over, the Scottish, with all their distilling, the barley and such, we really ran into some real problems because people were filling that same size tankard of ale, and that tankard was now filled with distilled liquor, which had a lot more alcohol per volume, and the amount of problems that happened. And so it started more in the faith community as a response from clergymen and the women of the church as they were seeing more abandoned children and more abandoned families and husbands disappearing and staying at the pub too long or just not coming home. And so they just felt, you know, people are consorting with Satan with this. This is that demon rum, you know, and that's language from back in those days. And beer, wine, and ale were still seen as the good creature of God. Over time that started to change until any and all alcohol spirits were seen as bad, and that eventually did lead to prohibition. But think about this. Originally, beer, wine, and ale were still seen as okay. Liquor was the problem, that hard liquor. And we still use those terms sometimes today, hard liquor. And, you know, well, it's just beer. It's not like it's, you know, whiskey. Now think about how we still do that, not only with alcohol, to the point it's been institutionalized, that our tax rate on beer, wine, and ale is different. Beer is the lowest tax rate, wine and ale get the next highest, and then there's this big leap to distilled liquor, which has the much higher tax rate. And days and hours of sale, where it can be sold, liquor's treated real differently, and yet beers are drink of choice in America. It's the kind of alcohol consumed most often before any drinking and driving crash, and the highest DUI rates with the highest blood alcohol levels. Beer is what was consumed before it. So beer can still be a problem. You know, it doesn't have to be the hard liquor. Alcohol is alcohol. A drink is a drink is a drink. You know, one beer is the same as a shot of, no, it's just weed. It's not like it's crack, you know. And even right now with this opiate crisis, I tell you, it's always interesting to hear people tell these stories, whether they're a family member or someone themselves in recovery or a community gatekeeper or leader like law enforcement, and they're so focused on the opiate issue that they're not paying attention to their data and what it's really saying and people's personal experiences, that alcohol and weed are still by far our biggest issue in communities and are usually precursors to prescription or opiate abuse. So if we're looking at prevention, we have to widen the lens and not look at only one kind of substance, but where does that substance fit into the continuum of all substance abuse and that full spectrum of substance abuse? Because we kind of get, you know, yeah, our focus is prescriptions or opiates, and we're ignoring alcohol and marijuana, which are a big piece of the puzzle there. So something to think about. What are we doing today that could outlive us, and are we being research-based? Doesn't just mean science-based in what works, but data-based in what's actually happening in our community. Are we getting overly focused on a singular trend without looking at how that trend plays within the entire scope of substance abuse? So just some thoughts for us to think about as we move forward here in Ohio especially. As we're looking at lessons learned, our second lesson is that we can influence choices, but we cannot control them. So a lot of times we you know, like to think, especially as parents or as teachers, that as we're looking at kids in our world, that we can control their choices. Hopefully you all have learned, even as parents, that that's an illusion. That really our strongest place of power comes from understanding our power of influence, that other than when they're little kids and we can actually pull them physically out of harm's way, we're not really controlling our kids' choices, especially the older they get. So have we done the work as parents, as schools, as society to socialize children and have them internalize healthy attitudes, beliefs, so they can follow through with healthy choices and behaviors? That's the key, and that especially as they age, understanding our power of influence. And the same can be true even as we're working with adults and working across the lifespan. Our power still comes from influence. We don't have a whole lot of control, and we gain more power when we expand and really exert the power of our influence. This is a real important lesson learned, and that is that something is not always better than nothing. There is an awful lot that folks do with great intentions that research has found will backfire, and we're going to look at two of the big ones here pretty soon here on our list of lessons learned. But before we do that, I want to kind of put something out there that, you know, I so often hear people say, But you know, if what I do helps only just one person, then it's so worth it. And it usually gets told in a more emotionally stirring way as the starfish story. And I don't know if you've heard the starfish story before, where there's a gentleman walking on the beach early one morning, and he sees up ahead a small figure, and he can't quite tell, but the figure seems to be picking stuff up and throwing it back in the ocean. And as he gets closer, he sees there's just a ton, hundreds of starfish in this area of beach that have all washed up on the beach. And there's this young kid picking up his starfish and throwing it back into the ocean, and picking up another starfish and throwing it back into the ocean. And the guy says to the kid, you know, what are you doing? He goes, well, if I don't throw them back, they're going to die out here, you know. And he said, look down the beach, kid. There's hundreds and hundreds of starfish. You're never going to be able to save them all. You know, how are you going to make any kind of real difference here? And the kid picks up that starfish and he throws it into the ocean, and he goes, I made a difference to that one. And then we're all supposed to cry and go, oh, yeah, okay, great. You know, you may be able to tell I'm really struggle with the starfish story. It's, to me, I understand it. I get the emotion of it. But I've worked too many budgets. I've worked on too many statewide committees to go, my God, are we really going to spend all these scarce public dollars and hope we only save one? You know, we got to do better than that. And not only that, if the stuff that we're doing potentially can backfire, as we're going to see in a minute, what if I do something that's not science-based with great intentions, but I actually harm one or two or three or more? You know, what if I harm even just one? It's so important that we get grounded in the science of what really works, even when it may go against our gut of what we think would work. And so we're going to take a look at that. And let's start with one of the big ones by doing a poll here. And I want to see what you guys think. So get yourself ready for your next poll. And the poll question is whether or not fear-based messages work. Can people be literally just scared away from engaging in a behavior or scared into stopping a behavior? Got a few more folks we're looking to vote. You could answer your poll. All right, let's take a look at these results. It sounds like the majority of you have learned or already knew that scare tactics don't work, but you may not understand why they don't work, and we want to talk about that today. Some of you did say scare tactics can work, and we're going to take a look at that, and some of you certainly were not sure, and that makes sense. You may have been hearing conflicting information about it. So let's go ahead and clarify, and just first by stating real clearly, scare tactics do not work. Research has been very clear on that. Now, I will say it is important to note that surprises a ton of people, and it surprised me when I first learned it coming into this field, because as human beings, our guts go to fear-based messages. Think of it, because parents have been doing it for years. Don't cross your eyes, they're gonna, and in your mind you probably already said, stay that way. You know, don't sit too close to the TV, you're going to go blind, you know. Things that we do all the time, particularly as parents, to be fear-based. And the research says that not only is this something that surprisingly doesn't work, it's one of those things that can actually backfire. All right, so there's an awful lot here about why scare tactics don't work. That what I'm going to ask to do, I want to continue on with our top 10 lessons, and then I want to circle back after we do a round of Q&A on all 10 lessons as a whole. We're going to come back and spend some time on scare tactics. So I'm going to ask a favor here. I'm going to stick a pin in this one and ask you to hold any questions on it as well, because after we get through all 10 lessons, we're going to circle back and look at why scare tactics don't work. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and proceed with our next lesson. Other things we've learned that can backfire is bringing in recovery or lead panels of folks who've had this problem of alcohol or drug addiction or DUI, and letting them tell their story as a cautionary tale to a universal general prevention audience and say, don't do what I did. And that's when we use a recovery content or strategy to try to meet a prevention goal. Now think about what that's doing in recovery. In recovery they talk about people who've been there and are on the other side of it and have found recovery, that they can share with folks still struggling their experience, their strength, and their hope. And that's a very powerful recovery tool, that if I sit in that audience and I'm still struggling with my own addiction, or I'm early in my recovery, by listening to other people's story and what they went through and how they found their recovery and how they're maintaining it, I can not only be inspired by that, but I can find tools or things I can connect to that can help me, so we can support each other in our recovery. That's a very powerful tool. But what happened is, about 1970-something, some money was put out from the feds, or carved out of the treatment money, and said, you guys spend 20% of your money on prevention. And there wasn't really formalized prevention practitioners, so treatment practitioners taught what they knew. And they're sitting here with connection to all these great recovery folks who are used to telling their story at 12-step meetings or in other recovery community places. And they say, well, you could tell a cautionary tale, and you're so good at telling your story. Let's take you out into a general prevention audience, for example, a high school gymnasium or a health class, and have you tell your story there. And then they'll learn from your mistakes. And what that has been found to do is absolutely not work. First off, kids who were never going to use, they do find certainly reinforcement to not use, but they were going to abstain anyway. Then you've got these kids that are more high risk, right on the other end of the continuum, who may be dabbling in it already or thinking about it, or are more high risk kids, and they don't take the same message. They hear more of the glamorization of the story of all the things that happened when this person was using. And then they usually hear a quick, but then I got help and everything got better. And as a kid, they're immortal, and they don't have life experience, and they don't have context for all of this. And in their mind, it's like, yeah, but I'm not like that person. I'm smarter than that. I wouldn't let that happen. Well, and if I did have a problem, I'd just go for treatment like he did, right? And they miss the point that we as adults can take from that as a cautionary tale, because they don't have the same life experience and context to put that story into. Add to it some of the things that are going to come up under scare tactics as well. When we look at these more high-risk young people or adults, honestly, that are wired more for risk-taking or sensation-seeking, they actually can get turned on, in a sense, by that story and get more intrigued rather than turned off by it and hear a caution from it. So we're going to come back to that as well when we get into the scare tactics piece, because that cautionary tale does not tend to work at all. In fact, research shows that it can absolutely backfire and increase use for our highest risk populations who are more likely to use if they weren't already using anyway. Now let's take that and put it aside and say, what if we tried a different strategy and made it the prevention panel? So if you had a group, for example, if we were working with kids, and you had a group of kids who were chosen to be drug-free, were drug-free peer leaders, maybe they're involved in a program like Youth to Youth or Teen Institute, and they're involved and have worked with some adults and have really honed how to tell their story, and they do what we call a drug-free panel. And they can go out to other kids and say, here's why I choose to be drug-free, here's how I do it, and here's the benefits I see from it. Now we're holding up an example that's the example we want folks to follow. And that's a much more research-based and positive way to approach this. So we're going to kind of stick a pin in the rest of that, because some other reasons why the cautionary tales don't work are the same as scare tactics. We will come back to that one. Another lesson learned is that it's not the kind of person someone is that causes alcohol and other drug-related problems. It's really the kind of choices that they make. And too often in our society, we have a lot of beliefs and attitudes about who's abusing alcohol and other drugs and why they may be abusing it. And a lot of that is wrapped up with some of our history. If you go way, way back again to the temperance movement, think about that. The temperance leaders were talking about evil spirits and demon rum, and people consuming that were cavorting with Satan. And eventually it got so polarized in our society that the drinker themselves got wrapped up in that and stigmatized as somehow evil or immoral. And it's got very split on moral lines. It even got split among Catholic and Protestant lines. And we have that whole history, and as that built and things got more and more where folks were being shunned for their use, alcohol group started to help this had to be founded in anonymity in the 50s, Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't have Cancer Anonymous. We don't have Diabetes Anonymous. You know, this is a health issue, a biochemical change that can change for anybody if they drink or use enough. And we got a lot of society saying drink, 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 especially today. And yet then when someone has a problem with it, we turn our back and go, oh, look at that, they couldn't handle it, you know, and we stigmatize the issue. So we really need to be careful. And sometimes in prevention, without meaning to, we end up accidentally reinforcing stigma by implying if you just feel good enough about yourself and you're responsible enough and you're the right kind of person, this won't happen to you, when it really can happen to anybody. Even emotionally healthy, well-adjusted folks can develop problems with alcohol and other drugs, especially drugs like alcohol and marijuana that are more normative. You know, the people who use those just to have a good time, they're not trying to escape anything, they're just out having a good time. They don't differ from the rest of us in any real way, right? And then when they start to have a problem with it, we shun them. That doesn't feel real fair. So we have to be careful in our language, and that's been especially true with this opiate crisis, as we sometimes have folks that are in maybe a community where the alcohol and drug issues have been pretty hidden and behind closed doors. Doesn't mean they weren't there, but they were behind closed doors. And now we've got folks who are taking a risk when it's happened in their family, and they're shocked that it happened in their family because they didn't think it was even happening in their community because they just never saw it or knew about it. And now that they're being open about it, they're also being open with their shock and implying, like, you know, it's even happening in our community now. Like, it only happens normally in those other kinds of communities. And the reality is it's always happened in every kind of community. It's just that now it's happened in that family, and it's someone who's willing to speak up about it. So we have to be careful of our language when we're trying to help the community own the problem so that they can fix the problem in their community. We first have to all own it. And this is a problem that's always been in every community. It just may have been more hidden in some than others. So we have to be careful, again, not to reinforce stigma. Hopefully it's all clear to everybody that prevention is not just for kids, that it is a lifespan issue, whether we're talking all the way down to from conception and you know, care in the womb and those neonatal issues, all the way to our elderly and medication use and abuse, or mixing medications with alcohol. Our largest group of substance abusers are between the ages of 18 and 30, and especially 18 to 25. And that's true not just in Ohio, that's nationally. The majority of substance abuse is adult use, and yet we focus so much on kids. And that makes sense with prevention because we're trying to, you know, get to it before it starts. But not everybody who's even using 18 to 30 is addicted. They're still a target for prevention. If you've never heard them before, and we're not going to have time to hit it today, but I'll definitely hit it in the next session 3, there is universal, selected, and indicated prevention. Those are different audiences, and indicated prevention is for folks who have already been using but are not yet addicted. And there's things we still can be doing there. And so, you know, whether an adult's already used or not, they are still a target for prevention. I just came here today after doing 2 hours from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. out at the tire warehouse, and did a excellent, if I do say so myself because I didn't write it, but it's a very good module on enabling. And it was powerful to sit here with, you know, folks who don't normally get access to that kind of information, and looking at their role in someone else's use, and doing alcohol module with them over the years, and marijuana, and really helping them get access to good safety and health information. And I think it's so important that we do that with more than just kids, because it certainly is also a workforce issue. Our next lesson learned is that just say no does not work. And I think we've all heard that. We've all known that. We usually all, sometimes even prevention, kind of make fun of the Nancy Reagan years. That was all well-intentioned stuff. It was a real timely thing to, again, be the movement, banging the drum and the movement of drawing attention to our alcohol and drug issues. But even then, those of us engaged in Just Say No activities knew that the just in Just Say No was problematic, because it's not just as simple as saying, don't do drugs, drugs are bad, you know, and just saying no. I got to know why to say no, and I have to internalize that, and I got to know how to say no, and I need to know that there's support for saying no. And my community that surrounds me needs to have norms and laws and rules and enforcement of those that supports safety and health choices, that we have good public health policies in place, and that we're all on board with making those healthy choices. So it's got to be more than just simply saying no. And so prevention's a lot more complicated than everyone really wants it to be. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in part 3 of the webinar next week. But let's hit 2 more of our lessons learned. When we are looking at the information, because that is a piece of the puzzle, is doing education and information, but not just any information is capable of changing behavior. What started to happen in our field is when we started doing the information model and giving people, if they just knew better, because, there was some real ignorance in the past. Morphine used to be sold as a cure for alcoholism in the Sears Roebuck catalog back in the colonial America days, or the frontier days of Little House on the Prairie kind of time, I don't know if that means Mrs. Olson was selling opium, but and morphine. But there were some crazy things where people just didn't know they didn't know, and snake oil salesmen and what they had in some of these, what we would call today over-the-counter meds, and there were no regulations and people didn't know what they didn't know. So folks looked at all that history and they said people just need to know better. If they knew what they knew, they wouldn't do this stuff. We'll educate them. And then when the problem kept happening, they kept taking it younger. Well, we just didn't get them young enough. So they kept taking a deeper, more intensive information about alcohol and drugs to a younger audience. That there I was in the early 90s working at the Columbus Health Department, and a coworker from another agency said, would you review this curriculum we've written for preschoolers? Preschoolers. And let me tell you, it was pretty intense curriculum even for middle schoolers. And while it was kind of preschool language, they're still talking about how it can make your liver sick. I don't think a preschooler really knows and can understand what a liver is and why it's important that it not be sick. It was not age appropriate. It was not developmentally appropriate. And I know those preschoolers by college age, because I had them in early 2000 working out at Capital University. They're sitting there with their arms crossed going, I've heard it all before. I know what I need to know. Yeah, don't do drugs. Drugs are bad. I know. And it didn't mean anything to their choices. That's metabolized in the liver. Shouldn't be doing that. It's not the appropriate information. So we got to be really careful to be age appropriate, and that our information has to be timely and based in persuasion, and that information alone is not going to do it anyway. Prevention, again, is more complex than a lot of people really want it to be. So last lesson learned is really to look at a comprehensive approach that addresses individual factors, community-based factors, not just knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, but community norms, access, availability, media messages, policy, and enforcement of those policies. And we're going to look at all of that in our part 3 of what that would look like. Mind you, it's an hour version, so it's not a master's degree program in prevention science. But we're going to give you a nice overview of what we mean by across the lifespan and a comprehensive approach and getting it grounded in some science. So this is the moment where you question, hoping you've sent them in already. Keep in mind that definition. I think we'll go proceed with the thing I think is the most people, and then even if you feel you on the call who've been allowed for trying a telephone. So if you could just pause, I'm going to switch to telephone real quickly, and let's see what that. Okay, this is Allison back via phone, and I'm going to just ask for an audio test check, and if Derek could maybe send us a message via the chat box to let us know, or if the rest of you can let me know if we're okay again. Shoot some okays into your question box, and Michelle will let me know if we're good to proceed. All right, great. Well, we'll just do the second half or second 10 minutes by phone here. That's all right. So let's go ahead and proceed with our lesson learned on scare tactics and really look at why they don't work. What's the reasoning behind that? Before we can do that, we need to all be on the same page about what we really mean by a scare tactic. So I want to see what you think a scare tactic is, and I've got another poll here for you. So if you could take a second. And again, as you look at that question, we're looking for what best describes a scare tactic. All right, let's go ahead and see those results. Kind of a mixed bit of results. We got a few of you talking about that it's any message that arouses fear. About a third of you that it's any dramatic representation of negative consequences. A couple with some exaggerated dangers or even inaccurate information that arouses fear. And 31% that any message where fear is the primary element of the message. So let's go ahead and take a look at a definition with that. Oops, I didn't share the results. If you want to physically see them, there they are. Sorry, I just went to hide it and I hadn't even shared it. Okay, so you can get a look more visually where everybody was at. All right, so let's take a second here and get a definition. I'm going to just humbly, from Allison's mind, propose this definition. And it's kind of got two parts, that it's an over-dramatization of the dangers in order to increase the motivation to avoid the behavior such as drugs or alcohol. But the other piece of this is very key, that it also really is that scare tactics tend to be based in the assumption that people can simply be scared into stopping a health or life-threatening behavior or never starting it. And so that over-dramatization is a real big piece of this, but so is just that it's any message that relies on fear alone for that change to happen or for prevention to happen. All right. So fear-based approaches, again, have a strong intuitive appeal. They're very tempting. They seem quite powerful to us. Our guts tell us as human beings this will work. We can just scare them away from things. Again, they've been used by parents for ages. If you work directly with any like drug-free youth leaders, for example, youth tend to go to this and think this is what will work best for their friends. Doesn't mean they're right. They're not research-based scientists usually. That's based in their opinion of what would work, right? So I think it's real important to still be careful, even if kids are telling us that they think it'll work, doesn't mean that it will. Because in fact, we've got a long history of research, but we also have a long history with scare tactics. You know, the Temperance movement way back in the day, they would talk about, you know, if you drink alcohol, you know, those evil spirits, that demon rum, and you belch near an open flame, you're going to burst into flames. Tales of spontaneous internal combustion from drinking alcohol. Now, is alcohol flammable? Sure. Baked Alaska, flambe, right? But doesn't mean people drinking alcohol just burst into flames at any given moment. We know Reefer Madness was a big push at scare tactics. 1970s, we had Scared Straight, and yes, thanks to cable television, it's back, whether we want it to be or not. Dave Toma went around when I was in middle school, and he would do these horrendous presentations and tell the most scary stories of people sticking knitting needles in their eyes and jumping out of windows and trying to scare folks. My 8th grade health teacher was great at that too, that she told us all young men in puberty who smoked marijuana will grow breasts, which of course means that everybody was checking out all the hoods, as we would call them back in the day, and checking out, you know, side view on the guys that would smoke out behind the back of the gym or out in the parking lot during football games, and we're trying to see if they got any little breasts going on there. And when we're finding that they don't, my teacher's credibility really, really was gone, right? And it's not that young men in puberty who smoke marijuana heavily can't grow breasts. It's that it's not incredibly common, and it's not the only negative consequence to worry about, but it also sparked in girls some questions like, hey, would that work for girls, you know? So we've got to be really careful with which little thing we latch onto. 1990s, we heard all this stuff about ecstasy creating holes in the brain, and it was really that it was a dark spot of inactivity on a brain scan, but it was like a dark hole in a brain scan, and it came to be talked about as a hole in the brain as if it's a flesh-eating virus. And that was a big misunderstanding in the 90s, and a lot of preventionists not going back to the research and just taking it as fact and sharing it based in this belief, if I have one more scary thing to tell them, I can keep them from using. And that's not good prevention practice, to be based in fear, especially when there's inaccurate information at hand. 2001, after September 11th, we were all told about how drug use supports terrorism, and not that it doesn't, and it's not how they were funded. It's, again, just based in somehow tying that to fear. Here in Ohio, we had the Painfully Obvious campaign, which was a big piece of things as well. Certainly the egg in the pan up there, you probably are all recognizing that one of this is your brain on drugs, right? All right, but I need you to remember, just because scare tactics have been used both formally and informally, and still will be over the years. And that's project out in, I think, Idaho. Just only a few years ago, spent a ton of money statewide, professionals doing that, and it was so scare tactic based. You still get stuff that comes out from the federal government or from a State Department that can be based in scare tactics. Just because there's research doesn't mean everybody's grounded in the research. Right? And so we need to help spread the word to folks that good intentions aren't enough here, because research shows that these tactics are ineffective and can backfire. And there's quite a list of research studies from all the way clear back to '69, a real seminal study on this, all the way through 2000, and it's recent, the most recent, more extensive literature review of all the research to date was from the National Institute of Health Science panel in 2004, and they put out quite a nice summary on this. And just one key quote from that is that programs that rely on scare tactics to prevent problems are not only ineffective, but may have damaging effects. In fact, the research has found any of these impacts that they do have tend to be very short-lived and mostly for folks who are already likely to abstain. And that instead we see 4 risks of scare tactics and how they can backfire. And here are the 4 findings that are so important, reasons why scare tactics don't work. First, I've already alluded to earlier, youth don't have a filter, the same life filter as adults. First off, the status of the brain development. We know that in the new brain development research out of Harvard that frontal lobe pieces of impulse control and exercising judgment is not fully in place until we're 25 or 26 years old. So that's a piece of this puzzle, that they don't have the full same brain functioning in some key areas where this information, they can follow through with what we intend this information to do. And they don't have context, and they don't have life experience. They don't have anything more than the common invincibility feeling of youth, And so what we take from a message when we hear it, and we go, God, anyone who hears that would be scared away from this. Kids don't hear it through the same filter, and they don't process it the same way we do, and especially if they're more of a high-risk kid that's wired differently, which takes us to risk number 2, that they can be more attracted to the behavior, that they're sensation seekers or risk takers, and those are 2 of 4 very common characteristics that are found to be shared among people who later have problems with alcohol and other drugs. And these are 2 real core characteristics that how they filter scare tactics or a recovery panel, for example, is very different. It can actually tweak it for them and make it seem more attractive to them. So that's a major backfire alert, because this is already our high-risk group that are more likely to have problems with alcohol and other drugs, and we're feeding them with something that actually can spark it and get them more interested in it. And again, I want you to go back to that starfish story. What if we turned it around and said, what if we hurt just one? What if we increase use for just one? Versus what if I save just one? Okay? So number 3 of our risks is that if the dangers are exaggerated, youth may disbelieve other prevention messages. It's all a big con job. The more adults that are caught in their mind lying to them or over-exaggerating something, the more every adult who says anything, even if it's solid and research-based and true and experiential, that it's all a big con job. They also don't want us to have a good time. If they look around and see other people using and they're okay. Like we looked around my 8th grade classroom, and the guys from the back of the gym parking lot didn't have any breasts,
So it doesn't mean that didn't happen in real life. It can, but it wasn't common enough that we just figured our health teacher was a liar. You know, her credibility was gone, as well every health teacher that followed her. And our fourth risk of scare tactics is that youth often dismiss these messages rather than feel fear, because again, the invincibility of youth. That could never happen to me. I'm smarter than that. I wouldn't let that happen. Right? Here's how I'm different, or I'm not like that person who had problems. So just a quick thought on those four risks. There's a great deal of research that support each of these in a very detailed way. This is just a very brief summary of four themes that we see in the research. But just another common sense thought. For years and years and years, around all these issues you see on your slide, people have been trying to use scare tactics for years, decades. If scare tactics works, we wouldn't have any of those problems. Prevention's more complex than we would all like it to be, okay? So as we take a look at summing up scare tactics, just a quick thought, because I've seen where we are on time and I see we have some questions. First thing to know is that you're human. Knowing that scare tactics don't work doesn't stop even me, and I've known this for years and looked at the research on it, from having a natural instinct of if they knew it, they wouldn't do it. We just need to scare them. And I got to tell you right now, bath salts scares the living heck out of me when I see what bath salts can be and what K2 can do to folks, and if they just knew. But I have to be willing to know what I know and not unlearn it, and recognize that natural gut instinct and be willing to pause and go, wait a minute, research says that's not the approach. I've got to identify other solutions for this, which is what we'll focus on in our next session. So we have to all stay vigilant so that we don't waste time, money, energy, and another precious resource, limited community attention. We have a lot of communities now finally awake to the opiate issue and the prescription pill issue in the communities here in Ohio. Are we going to waste that time of their limited attention span theater moment with something that's an ineffective message? Or are we going to harness that moment of their attention and all the money and the energy and our efforts to do something more meaningful that's going to be lasting and is based in science? That's the key. So, message test. Is fear the primary element of the message that you're designing? Can it stand the test of time? Will the message erode by light of truth or experience? And does it include concrete steps to avoid the problem? If there are negative consequences, and there is, you know, the reality that, you know, we need to share some of those with folks, you better have a way for them to help that not happen to them. So you can't rely on fear alone, in a sense, to do that message. So we got to be careful to not be, you know, fear mongers, basically, is the real important thing here. All right, I just see really where we are on time because we have a few technical difficulties and got started a little late here on content that I want to get us summed up because I see we have questions coming in. So I'm going to go ahead, take a second, and look through a couple of these questions and try to do it in the order in which they came in so that they may make sense with the order of the content here. And it looks like one question was, I'm not sure I'm following Matthew's question. When you say 12 speakers, do you mean 12-step speakers or recovery speakers, Matthew? I'm going to ask you to clarify that with our question person, and I'm going to come back to that one. Oops, maybe it wasn't Matthew that asked the 12 speakers one. Okay, thank you. Hitting on number 6 in what works in prevention, I think we need to inform people that it's okay to admit that they may or may not have a problem. We need to eliminate, yes, the social stigma that weakness is involved in admitting a possible problem and enforcing strength and courage with prevention. That's a great point, Matthew. Thank you for that comment. Another question, are we doing anything to set up a program related strictly to kids? Finding the link to a child and the dangers of drug and alcohol is key. Are we doing anything to set up a program related strictly to kids? Not sure what that's asking, but I can tell you that most prevention is focused on kids, and it's my hope that we in prevention widen our lens and get more across the lifespan. And that's some of what we're going to talk about next time is lifespan prevention versus kids-only prevention and what's changing in our field, because the money is drying up for kids school-based prevention. And things are changing about how we get these messages out, as well as other strategies beyond just messaging and information education. So I'm going to put a pin in that one too and encourage you to be on part 3 as well. All right, got clarification on Matthew's question. Not so sure that saying that 12-step speakers cannot reach out to people, as long as it's based on where drug and alcohol brought them and where did you find research and why it may increase use. I don't have at my fingertips those studies, but I can try to get those for you, Matthew. This is another tough one because it's kind of a sacred thing in our field, especially because our field was born of treatment, that if 12-step speakers are so great at telling their story, and if it is focused on where drug and alcohol brought them to, it really goes against our grain to believe that won't work. But I want to take you back to the 4 risks with scare tactics, because those exact same risks, at least number 1 and 2, are really important when it comes to the recovery panel. Their brain development's not in the same place. They don't have the life experience. And when it comes to our highest risk kids, the way they filter and hear that message is different. They don't take the cautionary part of the cautionary tale. They really hear it very differently. And then I guess that 3rd one too, but that won't happen to me. Here's how I'm different. And they get kind of a little rebellious to it. And there is some great research on that, and it's real important that we pay attention to that research. I see there's another question coming in, and I know we're past our time, so those folks that may need to go, we're going to wrap up here in the next 2 or 3 minutes if you can hang on. If you need to go, you can go. But we got one more question rolling in, and then I'm going to remind you of some housekeeping things and remind you of when Part 3 is. Okay. When we talk about parents who've lost a child to underage drinking or drinking and driving, the question is whether their personal story can be effective as long as another strategy is incorporated, incorporating other prevention, I think is what the question is. That kind of story is more helpful, parents speaking to other parents, to help those parents understand this can happen to you, and here's what you can do to do your part within your own family, and then to advocate within the community for more support and appropriate education for our kids. If we banded together as parents and demanded evidence-based prevention curricula in our schools, that's going to do more for us than bringing in that parent to speak to the kids themselves. So I think for parent-to-parent messaging, and then activating parents to be demanding more from their community for supporting. I'm doing everything I can in my family to keep my kid alcohol and drug free, but I need help. I can't do it alone. Okay? We're getting a rash of questions here. Yeah, I knew the second half was going to be where all of it was, so we probably needed this one to be a little longer than an hour. Michelle's writing as fast as she can. Let's do this, Michelle. I'm going to open up the question panel too, so maybe you don't need to do quite so much work there. All right, hang on a second. I just can't monitor questions while I'm presenting. Yeah, just point for me. Okay. Okay. So are we good on that one? Okay, I went too far down. All right. Well, we're running out of time, folks, so let's do this. We'll keep monitoring these questions, and I'll take them into account for Part 3. But let me go ahead, just because I know we've got folks who need to go places, and we try to keep to our hour, and I'm sorry we had a few difficulties. You were right where you're supposed to be if you're going, so, okay, you just told me a whole bunch about what doesn't work, and I'm still digesting it, but what does work? So, and it makes sense that that's really where your questions are all at right now, and that's why I invite you to be joining us for Part 3 of the webinar series on February, and actually, February 19th, same bat time, same bat channel, 11 to 12 Eastern time for those of you calling in from other locations, and encourage you to be part of Part 3. If you've not yet signed up for that, be sure you do that, and your emails should tell you how. Remember that you do need to still register through GoToWebinar to get the actual webinar link, that registering with us as an agency and stating your intent to be part of the webinar is not the same as registering with the technological systems here. All right, so with that, there's some contact information if you want to jot it down. We'll have that up again at the end of Part 3. And a few other things that I just want to remind you of and that is that a recording of this webinar, hopefully with a few of those auditory glitch moments cut out, will be available, if not by the end of this week, then certainly by the time of the next webinar, and will be available in our webinar center, as well as the handouts will be. Your certificates will come once you've completed your evaluation, which is going to be sent to you via email from Karen Downey. And once you complete that evaluation and send it in, and evaluations need to be completed individually, even if you were viewing it as a group, and that you also, if you're viewing this as a group, needed to have already coordinated with Karen to have a group sign-in sheet. If you have not done that, you need to email back to Karen, who sent you your confirmation that you need that sign-in sheet, or get to that email, because I believe she attached it to your confirmation email. So hopefully we are good on some of the logistic stuff. I'm sorry that I'm wishing that this was, of course, in person and we could have a great conversations and dialogue about all this information, because it's how I always prefer to train. But we are where we are in the world of technology, that we're left with webinars. So hopefully you'll be back for us in part 3. If you still have some outstanding needs or issues, especially just logistical issues, we will stay on the line and monitor those questions for the next 5 or 10 minutes. And otherwise, you are free to go. So thank you so much for your participation today.